For most of human history, being excluded from your group meant you were dead within days. Not metaphorically, literally dead. Your nervous system has not forgotten this. Social rejection registers in many of the same brain regions as physical pain, because for 290,000 of our 300,000 years as a species, the two were functionally identical. Every system built since then has treated this as a bug to be managed. Your legal system assumes a person who ignores tribal pressure sits on juries. Your democracy assumes a person who evaluates strangers without pattern matching chooses leaders. Your workplace assumes a person who separates feelings from performance reviews exists somewhere in your building. That person never showed up. And every time the system breaks, the designers look past the blueprint and blame you instead. That stops being mysterious the moment you understand what actually walked in the door. We write poetry, launch telescopes, and argue about the nature of consciousness, all with a brain that still panics. In traffic like a cornered animal, that gap between what we are capable of and what we are actually running on is the most important fact about us. Underneath the language and the philosophy, there is a primate with a stress response, built for the savannah, not the open plan office. We form bonds the way our ancestors did, in small groups, around shared threat and shared food. We feel shame and status and belonging in our bodies before we feel them in our minds. Reflection is real, and it matters. But it arrived late in the story, layered over hardware that was already ancient. That hardware does not disappear when we put on a suit or log into a voting booth. It runs quietly, in the background, shaping every choice we think we are making freely. We are not broken animals who failed to become rational. We are something stranger and more interesting than that. Take a Chihuahua and a Husky. Give them the exact same food, the same shelter, the same daily temperature. The Chihuahua is fine. The Husky is miserable, overheated, burning with energy it was literally bred to spend. Same species, same inputs, radically different outcomes. And nobody blames the Husky. Nobody calls the Husky deficient for struggling inside conditions built for a smaller animal. We understand without any argument that identical treatment produced unequal results because the animals themselves are different by design. Now, point that same logic at a classroom, a prison, a voting booth, an open plan office with fluorescent lights and no windows. The conditions were built for one kind of person, and when other kinds of people struggle inside them, we call that a personal failure. We measure the animal against the enclosure and conclude the animal is broken. The enclosure never gets questioned. The blueprint never gets pulled out. We just keep producing the same outcome and calling it a new problem. Your body started flinching before your brain finished processing the threat. That gap, that small, terrifying gap, is where your biology lives, and your philosophy does not. You cannot reason your way out of a startle reflex, no matter how calm you think you are. It appears in newborns who have never been taught anything, which means it did not come from culture. It arrived with the hardware. Disgust works the same way. Your face contorts before you have consciously decided something is revolting. The response is already running before. You have formed an opinion about it, and social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain, not a metaphor, not a poetic comparison. The same regions of the brain actually light up. Being left out of the group registers in the body the same way a broken bone does, because for most of human history, the two carried similar consequences. These three things, reflex, disgust, and social pain, did not come from your upbringing or your education. They came from millions of years of selection pressure that your conscious mind has absolutely no vote over. Any system that ignores this is not a system built for humans. Every instinct we carry fits into one of 7 broad domains. They run deeper than culture or law, and they do not wait for permission. Survival and self-preservation is the foundation everything else runs on. It is not one instinct among equals. It is the reason instinct exists at all. Reproductive and sexual instinct is where things get complicated, and we will spend more time on it in the next section because it does something surprising. Attachment and nurturing is the drive to protect offspring and bond with those we depend on. This one gets its own section later because it is load-bearing for everything in the back half of this video. Curiosity and exploration gets its own section too, because the shadow side of it is one of the most underexplored forces in human social life. Social and cooperative is the most important domain for everything that follows in this video. Hold on to it. Dominance and competence is the drive towards status, skill, and reputation. Hierarchies form here. Whether they protect the group or feed on it depends entirely on how they get built. Meaning-making may be the most distinctly human domain we have. Every culture that has ever existed built stories to explain why things happen, not some cultures. Every single one, without a documented exception. We will come back to that too. These are not personality quirks. They are not cultural artifacts. They are the operating system underneath everything else. The peacock tail is catastrophic engineering. It is heavy, bright, and makes the animal dramatically easier for a predator to catch. Evolution kept it anyway because it works as a signal, not for survival, for convincing a mate that you can afford the cost. The tail says, I am so fit I can carry this useless weight and still be standing here. That is the logic of costly signaling. The signal has to hurt to be believed. Something cheap to produce tells you nothing. Something expensive to carry tells you exactly how much the carrier can absorb. Humans run identical hardware with different materials, a degree from the right institution. A car that costs more than the transportation requires. A house with more space than anyone in it actually needs. These displays are not irrational from the inside. They are perfectly rational, given the social environment that shaped the animal making them. The design failure happens when institutions start rewarding the signal over the thing the signal was supposed to represent. You stop selecting for the underlying quality and start selecting for the display. The tail gets bigger, the animal underneath gets weaker, and we call the result a meritocracy. Curiosity is not a personality trait that some people have and others lack. It is a survival drive wired into the same ancient circuitry as hunger and fear. The brain does not release dopamine when you find the answer. It releases dopamine when you sense there might be one. That anticipation, that itch just before knowing, is the engine. Evolution built this because animals that investigated new things found more food, more shelter, more options. The ones who stayed. Comfortable died, comfortable and left nothing behind. But curiosity carries a cost most frameworks quietly ignore. When your questions challenge, wiring that kept our ancestors alive. Dissent feels like betrayal because for most of human history, it sometimes was. And it responds accordingly. Social rejection activates the same neural pain pathways as physical injury. The brain learns to weigh the thrill of knowing against the danger of belonging. Sometimes it chooses belonging, not because it is weak, because losing. The group used to mean losing everything. This is why intellectual courage is not just as personality strength. It is a genuine act of going against very old biological pressure. And systems that punish curiosity are not just stifling. They are activating exactly the threat response that shuts exploration down at the hardware level. Every human culture that has ever existed built stories to explain why things happen the way they do. Not some cultures. Not most cultures. Every single one, without a documented exception. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a cultural quirk you can trace to geography or climate. It is biological hardware running exactly as designed. The brain does not tolerate unexplained events the way a hard drive tolerates empty folders. It fills the gap. It builds a story. It assigns cause and intention to the world around it. Anthropologists call this the narrative instinct, and it shows up before language is even fully developed in children. Spirituality, philosophy, science, and mythology are not competing answers to the same question. They are the same cognitive drive, expressing itself through different cultural tools and different levels of evidence. Strip away the rituals and the symbols, and what remains is an animal that cannot stop asking why. That drive did not emerge because it is comforting or beautiful, though it can be both. It emerged because the creatures who found patterns survived longer than the ones who did not. Every primate group that has ever survived long enough to matter had a hierarchy inside it. That is not a political opinion or a cultural artifact. It is a biological fact. The question has never been whether hierarchies exist. It has always been whether they serve the group or feed on it. Competence hierarchies, where the most capable individuals take on the most demanding roles, appear in every stable human community we have ever studied. Dominance hierarchies, where status flows from fear and coercion, also appear, and they tend to collapse the groups that run on them. The difference between the two is not subtle once you know what to look for. A functional hierarchy routes resources toward the people who can use them best for everyone. A destructive one routes resources toward the people who are best at taking them. Our instincts can tell the difference. which is why bad leaders produce that specific, low-grade dread you feel in your body before your mind can name what is wrong. The signal is real. The hardware is reading something accurately. The problem is we built systems where that signal does not have anywhere to go. For most of human history, being cast out of your group was a death sentence. Your body learned that lesson so thoroughly it wired the threat of exclusion directly into your pain system. The same neural circuits that fire when you break a bone fire when someone cuts you out. Loneliness does not feel like sadness. It feels like an alarm, because for 2 million years, it was an alarm. Oxytocin drops when you lose connection and cortisol climbs to take its place, flooding your system with low-grade biological dread. Dopamine spikes when you are accepted, when you are seen, when you belong to something larger than yourself. These are not poetic metaphors for how community feels good. They are the actual chemistry of survival pressure encoded across deep evolutionary time. Your nervous system cannot tell the difference between a missed text and a tribal exile. It responds to both with the same ancient urgent signal: get back to your people. Dopamine does not reward pleasure the way most people think it does. It rewards the anticipation of something your brain has decided matters for survival. Cooperation, sharing food, reading a face correctly, these all trigger the same system as eating when you are starving. Your brain cannot tell the difference between a genuine social bond and a chemical shortcut that mimics one. That is not a flaw in the design. That is the contingency built into it. Evolution needed a system flexible enough to fire for hunting with your tribe and for surviving alone when the tribe was gone. The same circuit handles both because both kept your ancestors alive under different conditions. Addiction is not a hijacking of a healthy system. It is a perfectly healthy system running on the wrong input. The molecule does not know whether you earned the hit through connection or bought it through a needle. It fires, and your brain logs it as something worth repeating at almost any cost. The problem is not the person. The problem is what the person was given instead of what they actually needed. In the 1970s, a psychologist named Bruce Alexander ran a deceptively simple experiment. He gave isolated rats access to morphine-laced water, and they drank until they died. Then he built something different, a large enclosure with other rats, food, objects to interact with, and space to move. The rats in that environment, with the same drug available, mostly ignored it. They had somewhere to be and something to belong to. Alexander called it Rat Park. The results were complicated enough that they do not prove anything clean about human addiction, but they point at something real. Strip away connection, purpose, and belonging, and compulsive behavior fills the space those things left behind. The lesson is not that drugs are harmless in good environments. The lesson is that environment shapes behavior in ways that dwarf individual choice. We keep designing systems that punish the rat for drinking without ever asking what kind of cage we built. And then we call the drinking a moral failure. Conformity and reciprocity are not character flaws. They are ancient load-bearing tools that kept small groups alive. When everyone in a band of 30 follows the same norms, coordination becomes nearly effortless. But the same instinct that makes you mirror your neighbor's behavior also makes you punish deviation hard. Ostracism, shaming, and social exclusion are the enforcement mechanisms evolution handed us. They work. The problem is they work on everyone, including the person who is actually right. A lone voice warning about a bad decision gets silenced by the same machinery designed to silence genuine threats. To the group, reciprocity has its own shadow. The drive to repay kindness flips just as easily into the drive to repay harm. Vendetta logic is just reciprocity running without a circuit breaker. These are not bugs that crept in through bad culture or weak character. They are features of a coordination system built for a world that no longer exists around us. Your brain is making thousands of predictions every second, most of them before you are aware of anything. It is not doing this because it is careful or deliberate. It is doing this because it is fast. Speed is the whole point of the system. Every pattern your ancestors survived long enough to reproduce got wired into the hardware you are running on right now. When you feel unease around a stranger, or trust someone instantly, or freeze, before you can name why, that is not a character flaw loading. That is a survival system doing exactly what it was built to do. Unconscious bias is not a glitch in an otherwise rational mind. It is the pattern recognition engine running at full speed on social data. The categories it uses: in-group, out-group, familiar, foreign, predate language by millions of years. Calling this a moral failure misses the structure of the problem entirely. You cannot shame a reflex out of someone's nervous system with a training seminar. You have to change the conditions that make the reflex fire the way it does. The first stage of the bias cascade does not look like bias at all. It feels like clarity. Something triggers a strong emotional response, and the brain immediately treats that feeling as information, not a signal worth examining, actual proof that your read on the situation is correct. The feeling arrives before the reasoning does, and the reasoning never quite catches up. You do not notice the gap because the emotion fills it so completely and so fast. This is not a flaw in broken people. It is the default operating mode of a primate brain under social pressure. The stronger the feeling, the more certain you become, and certainty shuts down the inquiry that might correct you. Anger, disgust, fear, they do not just color your thinking. They replace it with something that feels indistinguishable from thought. And here is the part worth sitting with. This cuts in both directions. The person who says my feelings prove I am right, and the person who says feelings are unreliable and logic is superior are both in tier 1. Dismissing emotion entirely makes it impossible to understand why people act the way they do. Leading with emotion as proof makes it impossible to be corrected by evidence. Both are the same error wearing different clothes. Once emotion is running as evidence, something more dangerous kicks in. The brain stops processing incoming information as information. It starts processing it as a threat to the group that defines you. Psychologists call this identity fusion. When your tribe becomes part of your self-concept, facts that challenge the tribe feel like attacks on you personally. It is not a metaphor. It is a measurable neurological response that activates the same regions as physical pain. A study showing your side is wrong does not land as data. It lands like a wound. So, the brain does not evaluate the argument. It mobilizes against it. This is why intelligent people can be the worst at updating their beliefs under pressure. Higher verbal intelligence just means better tools for building the defense. The information never gets a fair hearing because the processing never got that far. And through something as simple as reframing, one word can be charged in two completely different directions for two different groups so that they are no longer even having the same argument. They are each defending against something the other person never said. Once a bias finds its way into a group, something almost mechanical starts to happen. The people around you do not just share the belief, they reinforce it, quietly, constantly, without meaning to. Every nod, every laugh, every story that fits the pattern adds another layer. The belief stops feeling like a guess and starts feeling like something you know. At that point, outside correction does not register as new information. It registers as an attack on the group itself. The person offering it is not seen as helpful. They are seen as a threat to something people have built together. And the group closes ranks, not out of malice, but out of the same tribal wiring that kept our ancestors alive. Dissent feels like betrayal because for most of human history, it sometimes was. The narrative is not just believed now. It is load-bearing. It holds identities, relationships, and shared meaning in place. Removing it does not feel like a correction. It feels like demolition. A small group catches its own errors because the feedback is immediate and personal. Someone in a village says something wrong and 3 people who know better push back that afternoon. The correction travels faster than the mistake and the story gets revised before it hardens. Scale that same dynamic up to a city, a nation, a platform with 2 billion users, and the physics change entirely. The mistake now travels at the speed of a share button, while the correction still travels at the speed of trust. Trust is slow. It requires relationship, repetition, and time. At mass scale, bias cascades do not just survive longer. They get institutionalized, written into policy, encoded into algorithms, taught in schools as settled fact. The group that could have corrected the error is now too small to be heard above the noise. Size is not just a logistical variable. It is the variable that determines whether a system can heal itself at all. Before your conscious mind forms an opinion, your body has already run a full background check on the person in front of you. It is scanning micro-expressions, the involuntary flickers that cross a face in under a quarter of a second. It is reading posture, breath rate, and the subtle tension around someone's eyes. None of this is deliberate, and almost none of it reaches your awareness as a thought. You just feel something, a vague sense of ease or unease, and you call it instinct. What you are actually running is threat detection software calibrated over millions of years of primate social life. The system is remarkably precise, but it depends entirely on the signals being legible. Botox disrupts exactly this. When the muscles that carry micro-expressions are frozen, the face goes quiet in ways the brain reads as wrong. People report trusting Botox users less without knowing why, without being able to name a single thing that felt off. The signal got corrupted and the whole read failed. Western beauty standards are making people neurologically harder to trust without anyone intending that outcome. The hardware is working perfectly. The input just got altered. The brain does not evaluate a broken system the way a policy analyst would. It scans for danger and change registers as danger. The nervous system cannot easily distinguish between a threat to the structure and a threat to your survival inside it. That is not irrationality. That is the oldest operating logic your body knows. The creatures who abandoned familiar ground too quickly got eaten before they could reproduce. The ones who hesitated, who needed overwhelming evidence before moving, those are your ancestors. You are descended from the ones who stayed put. So, when someone proposes dismantling a harmful institution, the people inside it feel genuine fear, not confusion, not stubbornness. Actual physiological threat response. The system does not have to be good to feel safe. It only has to be known. Novelty carries a cost that familiarity never does, even when familiarity is slowly killing you. That asymmetry is baked into the hardware, and no rational argument dissolves a physiological alarm. You cannot talk someone out of a reflex by explaining why the reflex is wrong. When a group senses danger, the tolerance for dissent drops, and the pressure to align spikes almost immediately. This is not weakness or cowardice in the people involved. It is ancient hardware doing exactly what it was built to do. A tribe that argued internally, while a predator circled the camp, did not survive to pass on that habit. So, the brain learned to treat disagreement as a threat when the stakes feel high enough. The problem is that the same system fires whether the threat is a predator or a political rival. Conformity moves. Through a group the way fire moves through dry grass, fast and almost impossible to stop once it starts. Each person who falls in, line makes it harder for the next person to hold out. By the time the cascade completes, the group looks unanimous. But it never really was. What we call extremism is often just ordinary social instinct running at full volume under pressure. The instinct is not exotic. It is not foreign. It is the same one sitting in every person in every room, waiting for the conditions that let it run. Your brain tracks relationships the way a spreadsheet tracks data, except the spreadsheet has a hard row limit. Robin Dunbar found that across primate species, neocortex size predicts stable social group size with uncomfortable precision. Bigger cortex, bigger group, not because smarter animals like each other more, but because tracking relationships is genuinely expensive cognitive work. For humans, that ceiling lands somewhere around 150 people. Not 149, not 200, just roughly, stubbornly, persistently 150. That number keeps showing up in hunter-gatherer bands, Roman military units, and functional company teams across centuries and continents. Dunbar was not claiming a magic threshold. He was pointing at a biological constraint that nobody asked for and nobody can simply override. Beyond 150, the brain starts losing the thread on who owes whom, who can be trusted, and who belongs. Social coherence does not gradually soften. It fractures. The group stops feeling like a group and starts feeling like a crowd. And crowds behave very differently than communities do. The number 150 is not a wall you hit all at once. It is a set of nested rings, each one a different kind of relationship your nervous system is actually built to maintain. The innermost ring holds roughly 1 to 3 people. These are the ones whose loss would genuinely reorganize your life. The next ring out holds around 5 to 8. The people you would call in a genuine crisis. Beyond that sits a layer of about 8 to 12. Close friendships, built on enough shared experience that you can read each other without explanation. Then comes the 12 to 25 range, your core trust network, the people whose reputation you track and who track yours. The 15 to 25 range is where humans actually live in the fullest sense, small enough that everyone remains visible, small enough that drift gets noticed before it becomes rot. At 30, the diffusion starts. At 50, familiarity goes surface level. At 150, loyalty is tribal rather than personal. Strip any of these rings away and the human animal does not just feel lonely. It starts to malfunction in ways that look a lot like modern life. The number itself is not the point. The structure it implies is what matters. Clusters of 15 to 25, people form the base unit, not a flat blob of 150. Nested layers. Those clusters feed into a village layer of 75 to 150 that interlock with other villages without dissolving the coherence of the smaller units underneath. You scale nested, not flat, so the thing that makes the small unit work does not get crushed by the weight of the larger one. Inside the cluster, everyone remains visible to everyone else. Redundancy exists, so no single person carries everything alone. There is a consistent adult presence for children, rather than rotating authority figures. Children are told to trust simply because an institution says so. Adults maintain real close friendships, 8 to 12 people whose character they have watched under stress. Not acquaintances, not colleagues. People with real mutual accountability over real time. None of this requires land or a rural zip code or a return to some imagined past. It requires intentional design, repeated contact, and shared stakes between the same recurring people. The failure of modern cities is not density. It is the absence of these nested, overlapping, reliable layers inside the density. A structure on paper is just a drawing until people inside it do something together repeatedly. The practice that activates a Dunbar cluster is almost embarrassingly simple. One household announces a need. Others respond. Children go with their parents and watch adults ask for help without shame and give help without superiority. Sometimes the need is real. Sometimes it is a practice run, a deliberately constructed opportunity for the culture to rehearse the loop before collapse forces it. Then the household prepares a meal from what was given and feeds everyone. Giving and receiving becomes a complete visible cycle that the children absorb without being taught it in words. Repetition is what converts a neighbor into a known quantity, and a known quantity into someone you will actually call at 2 in the morning. The cluster becomes real the moment obligation and reciprocity have a weekly heartbeat. Structure runs on rhythm, not paper. The ritual is not symbolic, it is the mechanism. Before you could speak, your nervous system was already taking notes on the world. Every time a caregiver arrived when you needed something, it logged that as evidence of a safe environment. Every time no one came, it logged that as evidence of danger and adjusted accordingly. This is not metaphor. It is literally how the brain builds its predictive model of social reality. The nervous system is running a continuous forecast. Will connection be available when I need it most? That forecast gets calibrated in the first years of life, long before conscious memory can even form a record. The caregiver is not just feeding a body. They are shaping the architecture of a threat detection system that will color every relationship that follows. And once that system is calibrated, it does not wait for new evidence before it acts. It fires first, asks questions, later, and colors every room the adult walks into with assumptions formed before they had language for them. The map drawn in infancy becomes the terrain the adult believes is real. The nervous system does not build one universal map. It builds the map that fits the territory it actually lives in. Secure attachment develops when a caregiver shows up consistently. The child learns that reaching out works, that connection is safe, that the world responds when you need it. That becomes the foundation everything else gets built on. Anxious attachment develops when the caregiver is present sometimes and absent or distracted other times. The child learns that connection is unpredictable. So, you had better stay loud and close to have any chance of being seen. Love becomes pursuit rather than peace. That is not a flaw. It is a rational solution to an inconsistent environment. Avoidant attachment develops when reaching out is met with coldness or withdrawal. The child learns to stop reaching, to self-contain, to treat closeness as a threat rather than a resource. It worked. The pain of reaching and being rejected was worse than the pain of not reaching at all. Disorganized attachment develops when the caregiver is also the source of fear. The child has no coherent strategy because the same person is both the solution and the danger. The nervous system wants connection and fears it simultaneously, and produces chaotic responses as a result. Every one of these is an adaptation. A nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems are designed to do with the information it was given. For most of human history, no mother raised a child alone, and no father was the sole provider for his family. Children were raised by a rotating presence of grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and unrelated adults who all had skin in the game. Anthropologists call this alloparenting, and it was not a backup plan. It was the original plan. The nuclear family, two adults and their children sealed inside a single dwelling, is a historically strange arrangement that most of our ancestors would barely recognize. It emerged not from biology, but from industrialization, from the economic forces that pulled extended kin apart and scattered them across cities. We then handed that isolated unit every task the village used to share and called it normal. When parents crack under that pressure, we diagnose them with burnout or poor coping skills. We treat it as a personal failure when it is a structural one. The system was never designed for two people doing the work of 20. The two adults are not failing. The enclosure is. Two adults walk into a structure that was designed for 12 and wonder why they are exhausted. Every demand that lands on the household lands on the same two people with nowhere else to go. When one parent hits their limit, the other absorbs the overflow and then hits theirs. Children read that tension the way their nervous systems were built, to read it as a signal that the group is failing. Cortisol rises, attachment behavior escalates, and the adults interpret that as the children causing the problem. The system is producing exactly the outcome a poorly designed system produces, and everyone inside it blames themselves. So, you had better What you are left with is two primates trying to hold a social structure that our biology never intended two primates to hold alone. The failure is not a character failure. It is a load-bearing failure. The structure was underbuilt from the start. A child's nervous system does not treat all adults as interchangeable. It never has. Attachment research is unambiguous on this. Children need a small number of consistent figures to feel genuinely safe. When safety is established, the brain can shift resources toward learning, curiosity, and risk-taking. When it is not, those resources go toward vigilance instead. The child who seems distracted or defiant in September is often a child whose attachment system is still calibrating to a new face. Most school systems rotate teachers every single year. A new face means a new relationship that has to be built from scratch every time. For younger children especially, that cost is not trivial. It is neurological. We call it a behavior problem, and we respond with discipline. What we are actually looking at is a primate running ancient social software in an environment that ignores what that software requires. The system was not designed around the child. It was designed around administrative convenience. The child absorbs the difference every year without anyone naming what is actually happening. A child's nervous system is not waiting for love in the abstract. It is waiting for specific people. 1 to 3 primary attachment figures is the architecture the research points to consistently. 1 is fragile. 2 creates redundancy. 3 creates stability. Not perfect caregivers. Consistent ones, reliable enough that the brain can stop, scanning for danger and start learning instead. Beyond that core, children need a stable educational anchor, one place, one set of adults who know their name and notice when something is off, and then a wider ring of vetted secondary adults, people the parents know well and trust personally, so the child is surrounded by people whose character has been verified by someone who loves them. These adults buffer what parents cannot provide. They offer somewhere safe to bring things the child cannot bring home. When a child tells a trusted adult something they cannot tell a parent, that is not betrayal. That is nervous system redundancy. And redundancy is what makes a system resilient instead of fragile. Parenthood in this frame is not a feeling or an identity. It is a behavior pattern repeated across thousands of ordinary days. The child's nervous system is scoring every repetition, building either a foundation or a fault line. The child who never got a reliable caregiver does not grow out of that hunger at 18. It migrates. It finds a new object. And in a democracy with mass media and professional image management, there is no shortage of objects offering exactly what was missing. This is not stupidity. It is not weakness. It is a nervous system doing what nervous systems do when a developmental need goes unmet. It keeps looking. It stays alert for the signal it never got. Certainty feels like safety to a person who grew up without either. Strength feels like protection to someone whose early environment had none. A political figure who projects absolute confidence is not appealing to reason. They are appealing to something much older and much harder to argue with. Securely attached adults tolerate ambiguity better. They can hold complexity without it feeling like a threat to their identity. They are less likely to need a leader to be a parent because they already got what they needed from one. The political landscape we are living in right now is partly an attachment map of the generation that built it. You cannot fully understand what is happening in any election without understanding what happened in the chilled rooms 30 years before it. Mass democracy asks you to evaluate hundreds of strangers with no shared history and no reputation on the line. Your brain did not evolve for that task, and it shows up in every election cycle. The cognitive tools you are using were built for a village of roughly 150 people. In that village, you knew who lied, who kept their word, and who disappeared when things got hard. Reputation was the infrastructure, and it worked because everyone could see everyone else's behavior over time. Scale that village to 300 million, and the infrastructure collapses. You are now voting on faces, slogans, and the emotional residue of 30-second ads. The signals you are reading were designed by professionals to activate exactly the tribal hardware you are running on. None of this is stupidity. It is a mismatch between the cognitive tools you have and the scale you are being asked to operate at. The system was built for a rational agent who reads policy papers. It got a primate who trusts familiar faces. Those are not the same thing, and pretending they are has not been working. Every leadership system we have ever built asks strangers to judge someone they have never watched under pressure. You vote for a face, a voice, a carefully managed set of impressions from a distance. The problem is not that voters are stupid. It is that trust was never designed to work at that scale. Trust is a local phenomenon built through proximity, repetition, and skin in the game. What if the people choosing a leader were only ever the people who had already worked alongside them? At the cluster level, your neighborhood selects a representative who earned that role by solving real problems at street level. That person joins a wider council, and only that council selects the next tier up. Each level chooses based on demonstrated fitness, not performed charisma. Nobody campaigns to a crowd of strangers because nobody ever faces a crowd of strangers. The signal stays clean because the people reading it are close enough to know when it is real. Reputation does the work that advertising currently does, and reputation cannot be bought from people who watched you fail and saw what you did next. Power without a ceiling does not stay stable. It compounds, and the dominance instinct does the rest. Every system that has ever handed authority to a person without a hard limit on that authority has eventually regretted it. The constraint is not a sign of distrust in the individual holding power. The constraint exists because the instinct to hold and expand power is older than any individual's good intentions. No permanent authority means exactly that. No exceptions, carved out for competence or crisis or popular demand. Immunity from consequence is the single fastest route to a leadership class that stops serving the group. Transparency is not a courtesy extended to the public. It is the structural mechanism that keeps the dominance instinct from operating in the dark. Stage removal processes exist so that accountability does not require a revolution to enforce. These are not design preferences you can trade away for efficiency. They are the load-bearing walls of any governance structure built for the animal that actually shows up. The jury system was built on a genuinely good premise: 12 ordinary people standing between power and punishment. That premise has never been wrong. The execution has a structural flaw that almost nobody wants to say out loud. You take untrained civilians, people with no framework for evaluating evidence under pressure, and you hand them to two professional persuasion machines. One is trying to convict, the other is trying to acquit. Neither one is trying to find the truth. The outcome of a trial tracks the quality of the framing far more reliably than it tracks what actually happened. Jurors do not deliberate from a neutral baseline. They arrive carrying every bias, every fear, every tribal instinct we have spent. This entire video mapping. The system was designed as if those instincts did not exist, as if 12 strangers could simply reason their way to justice. They cannot. And we have known that for a very long time. Calling it a jury of your peers does not change what the hardware inside those peers is actually doing. The courtroom might be the single place where the rational actor myth does the most damage because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. A witness takes the stand and swears to tell the whole truth. But memory does not work that way. Every time you recall something, your brain quietly rewrites the file. Details shift. Confidence rises. The witness is not lying. They are reporting what their memory currently contains, which is not the same thing as what happened. A defendant sits before a jury and is judged as though fear, poverty, and trauma had no bearing on their choices. The jury itself is 12 strangers asked to reason their way past instinct, status games, and whoever spoke loudest in the deliberation room. Jurors defer to confident voices the way any primate defers to dominant ones. The defendant's appearance, accent, and composure all shape the verdict before a single argument lands. We built a system for a perfectly rational witness, a perfectly rational defendant, and a perfectly rational jury. Then we filled it with humans and called it justice. The gap between those two things is not a flaw in the people. It is a flaw in what we assumed about them before we started. Random selection sounds democratic. What it actually does is hand life-altering decisions to people with no training for making them, which is a strange thing to call fair. A reformed deliberation model starts with a different premise. Judgment is a skill. You can screen for it, teach it, and verify it before anyone enters the room. A civic panel drawn from a rotating pool of citizens who have completed basic epistemic training. How to identify a logical fallacy. How to recognize confirmation bias running in yourself in real time. How to separate what you know from what you are assuming. The pool stays broad so it does not calcify into an elite, but entry requires demonstrated competence, not just a summons. Cognitive diversity matters as much as demographic diversity, because homogeneous thinkers converge on the same blind spots every time. Structured deliberation protocols prevent the loudest voice from collapsing the group into false agreement. Continuous demonstrated fitness is required, not seniority. If you can no longer meet the standard, you do not keep the seat. The same logic we apply without hesitation to pilots and surgeons. The goal is not a perfect jury. It is a jury that fails in smaller, more correctable ways than the one we have now. Every system examined in this video broke the same way. Not because humans are weak or selfish or irrational, because the design kept ignoring the animal entirely. The same fictional character sat at the center of every blueprint. A calm, rational, self-interested agent who processes information cleanly, resists tribal pressure, and responds to incentives without friction. That person has never walked into a courtroom, a voting booth, a school, or a family dinner. Not once in all of human history. The creature that actually shows up is tribal, emotional, deeply wired for belonging, and running software roughly 200,000 years old. The gap between the blueprint and the animal is not random noise. It is the signal, the consistent signature of a primate whose brain was shaped by a world that no longer exists around it. So, the shift is not complicated. Even though it is hard, you stop fighting the hardware and you start building around it, not surrendering to every impulse, not excusing every failure of judgment, treating human psychology the way an engineer treats gravity, as a fixed condition you design for, not a flaw you design against. Gravity does not care that your bridge would be more elegant without it. Your tribal instincts do not care that your political theory assumes otherwise. The systems that have actually held communities together share one quality. They channel what we already are toward outcomes we actually want. They make cooperation feel like belonging, not compliance. They make accountability feel like repair, not punishment. That is the whole shift, not a softer civilization, not a more permissive one, a more honest one that starts from what shows up instead of what we wish would. Every system we examined was built on the same foundational assumption about human nature. The assumption is not malicious. It is a shortcut that became a blueprint nobody ever questioned. Somewhere along the way, we decided the person inside the system was rational, self-interested, and emotionally consistent. We designed addiction policy around that person, and real humans kept relapsing anyway. We designed democratic institutions around that person, and real humans kept voting on tribal feeling instead. We designed family structures around that person, and real parents kept drowning in isolation and shame. The fictional rational agent showed up nowhere, but the systems kept running as if it had. That is not a policy failure or a cultural failure. It is a design failure, and it compounds every single generation. The animal that actually walks into these systems is wired for small groups. emotional contagion, and status hierarchies. Until we build for that animal, we are just recycling the same elegant mistake with different branding. None of what has been proposed here is speculative, and none of it requires inventing something that does not already exist. Intentional communities built around Dunbar-scale social limits have been running for decades across multiple continents. Restorative justice programs operating inside real court systems show lower reoffending rates than traditional sentencing does, consistently. Attachment-informed parenting support delivered through neighborhood-based networks measurably reduces family breakdown over time. Participatory budgeting already tested in cities from Porto Alegre to New York hands genuine fiscal decisions back to the people they affect most. These are not utopian experiments sealed off from friction and human messiness. They are working inside it. The objection that these ideas are impractical keeps arriving from one direction, while evidence of them functioning keeps arriving from another. The real objection is not that they cannot work. It is that they threaten arrangements that currently benefit someone. And that is a very different kind of problem than a practical one. The rational actor model has survived this long because some very powerful institutions need it to survive. If people are rational, then failure is personal, and the system walks away clean every single time. Addiction becomes a choice rather than a design flaw in how dopamine meets unlimited supply. Debt becomes irresponsibility rather than a predictable outcome of predatory lending aimed at known cognitive limits. Political apathy becomes laziness rather than the exhausted response of a primate, brain being asked to navigate a scale it was never built for. The fiction is useful, and useful fictions tend to find well-funded defenders without anyone having to organize a conspiracy. Economists, legal theorists, and policy architects built careers on models that assume away the messy animal underneath. Dismantling those models means dismantling the credentials and the institutional authority built on top of them. That is not a plot. It is just the ordinary gravity of professional self-interest, doing what it always does. The people who benefit most from the current design are rarely the ones asked to fix it. Knowing a system is broken does not automatically hand you the tools to fix it. The gap between a correct diagnosis and a workable solution is real, and it is often enormous. People who point that out are not wrong. They are just not finished thinking. Difficulty of implementation is a genuine obstacle. It is not a refutation of the underlying argument. We do not dismiss the germ. Theory of disease because washing hands is inconvenient for surgeons running behind schedule. The structural critique stands on its own, separate from whether acting on it is easy or politically comfortable. Collapsing into fatalism is just another way of protecting the current design from scrutiny, and the current design is failing the people it was built to serve. Holding the tension means staying honest about both things at once. The argument is sound and the path forward is genuinely hard. That is not a contradiction. It is the actual starting point. You do not need a policy change or a movement to start building for the animal you actually are. The unit that works is 15 to 25 people, and that number keeps showing up across cultures and across time. At that scale, reputation is visible, contribution is legible, and free riding gets noticed before it metastasizes. You know who shows up when things get hard and who quietly disappears when the cost goes up. That is not sentiment. That is the accountability structure your nervous system was literally built to run. Governance does not have to happen at the national level to matter. A household, a small team, a tight neighborhood block, a group of people that became something more. These are the laboratories where the real redesign begins. You do not need permission from an institution to change the attachment patterns inside your family. You do not need a mandate to restructure how your small community handles conflict or care. The scale where the hardware works is already within reach. It has always been within reach. We just stopped building there. This video made a structural argument, not a political one, not a moral one, a structural one. The claim is simple. Every major system examined was designed for a person who does not exist, and the consistent gap between that. Design and actual human behavior is not random. It is the predictable output of hardware being run in the wrong enclosure. That claim is supported by evolutionary biology, attachment research, cognitive neuroscience, and anthropology. These are not fringe disciplines, and this is not a fringe reading of them. This is not claiming instinct is destiny. It is not claiming that redesigning institutions fixes what is broken in people. It is not claiming the animal is innocent of everything or responsible for nothing. What it is claiming is that you cannot build systems that work by pretending the animal is something it is not. That approach has been failing consistently across centuries, and calling the failure a human problem instead of a design problem. The diagnosis is sound. The alternative architecture exists in functioning form. The only thing that has ever been missing is the willingness to take the animal seriously. None of this requires waiting for permission. The scale where the hardware works is not a policy proposal. It is a decision about who you eat with, who you call when things go wrong, and whether the people around your children actually know your children. It is a decision about whether the adults in your life know you well enough to tell you something you do not want to hear. These are not grand structural reforms. They are choices available to almost anyone reading this right now. The Dunbar cluster does not need a name or a manifesto. It needs the same 15 to 25 people showing up for each, other with enough regularity that reputation becomes real and obligation becomes mutual. That is it. That is the whole unit. Everything larger gets built on top of that, or it does not hold. You do not fix mass democracy by winning an election. You fix the conditions that produce broken democracies by producing adults who got what they needed early enough that they are not looking for a parent in a candidate. That work starts at the scale of a household, a classroom, a block. The revolution, if there is one, is going to be embarrassingly small at the beginning. Every time a system fails, we look for someone to blame. The politician who lied, the addict who relapsed, the parent who could not hold it together, the juror who got it wrong, the voter who chose poorly. We locate the failure in the person and leave the blueprint untouched. That move protects the design. It always has. If the human is the variable, then the system is always innocent, and reform is always about making people better, rather than making conditions different. It is a very convenient conclusion for everyone who built the conditions. The animal is not the problem. The animal is ancient, tested, and remarkably well suited to the world it actually evolved for. The problem is the gap between that world and the one we built, on top of it without ever asking whether the animal could live there. Closing that gap does not require a perfect human. It requires an honest one, honest enough to look at the blueprint, honest enough to admit what it was designed for, and honest enough to start building something different. Every system we examined broke the same way, not because humans are weak, because the design ignored the animal entirely. We kept writing rules for a calm, rational, self-interested agent who processes information cleanly and responds to incentives without friction. That person has never walked into a courtroom, a voting booth, or a family dinner. The actual creature who shows up is tribal, emotional, deeply wired, for belonging and running software roughly 200,000 years old. That is not a flaw to be corrected. It is the material you build with. Dunbar's number is not a ceiling. It is a spec sheet. Attachment theory is not an excuse. It is an instruction manual. The instincts we have been punishing are the same ones that held communities together for most of human history. The mismatch is the crisis, not the animal. And if we are serious about building something that actually works, we have to start by being honest about who we are building it for.